I remember when we were what we used to call youngins years ago. My mother got really, really angry with my brother and me one day. He and I had always had a bit of sibling rivalry going on. And of course, at least some of you may remember the exchange on the old ABC sitcom Home Improvement, when Tim the Toolman Taylor and his wife Jill are discussing why their three sons fight so much. When Jill asks Tim if he knows what causes sibling rivalry, Tim replies, having more than one kid. Anyway, when we were young, my brother, who's not quite 4.5 years younger than I am and could never stand to do anything by himself, would come around and pester me when I was perfectly happy trying to read or do something, until I'd sort of swat at him, trying to get him to go away and leave me alone. Then he'd run to our maternal grandmother, who lived with us, complaining, "Grandma, he hit me." And of course, Grandma would always take his side and blame me. It got so bad that even some of the neighbors noticed what was going on, and one of them mentioned it to my mother after Grandma Jones had died. Well, what angered my mother this particular day was that my brother and I had picked up this bad habit from somewhere. When we irritated each other, as often happened, we'd gotten into the habit of saying something like, "I ought to kill you." Now, to be fair, Joyce used to talk about this interview she'd once seen in which Ruth Bell Graham, the wife of famed evangelist Billy Graham, was asked whether she'd ever considered divorcing Billy. Divorce? No. Murder? Yes, she quipped in reply. But do you remember the old saying, "If Mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy"? Well, Mama was definitely not happy that one particular day. She marched my brother and me into the kitchen and made us sit down at the table. Then she went over to the drawer, got out a couple of steak knives, the sort with those serrated edges, plopped one down in front of each of us and told us that she was fed up with listening to us. So if we really wanted to kill each other, we should just go ahead and have at it. You have to remember, both her parents were born in 1910. The shocked silence with which this pronouncement was met proved that she'd gotten our attention. Now, I won't recommend her methods, of course, but in retrospect, I do have to agree with her point. We needed to be conscious of the effects that our loose talk could have and act accordingly. After all, it's not for nothing that Jesus is recorded as having said that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment, which is Matthew 12:36 in the King James. The third chapter of the letter of James in the New Testament, which is traditionally ascribed to the brother of Jesus, has this to say on the subject. We all make many mistakes. And if anyone makes no mistakes in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body also. If we put bits into the mouths of horses that they may obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Look at the ships also. They are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So the tongue is a little member and boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire, and the tongue is fire. The tongue is an unrighteous world among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the cycle of nature, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature, can be tamed and has been tamed by humankind. But no human being can tame the tongue, a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, this ought not to be so, which is James 3:2-10. Now this morning we're just over a week past the attempted assassination of one of the two leading candidates for the highest elective office in this country. A rare enough event that I can name only 3 other times in the past 112 years that an active candidate on the campaign trail has been shot. And the last time was 52 years ago. And I have to say that I've seen some poor behavior on both sides of the political divide over the course of the last week. On the one hand, it wasn't more than several hours after the shooting that the man who has since been chosen to be the intended victim's running mate was blaming the other political party for intemperate words and stoking everyone's tempers to the boiling point. This, of course, conveniently overlooks the fact that his own candidate has been doing exactly that for nearly a decade now. Or some of the intended target's other followers have been eulogizing him in almost messianic terms, rhapsodizing about how miraculous it was that their dear leader turned his head at precisely the right moment to save his life. It must be the hand of God at work. This, of course, raises the question of why God would intervene on behalf of this one man whose moral record is as sketchy as anybody's at best, but do nothing to save entire classrooms full of school children from shooters. On the other side of the political spectrum, people have tended to act poorly in one of 2 ways. Some have suspected that the whole thing was a setup. The problem here is that it makes light of the suffering of the other victims and the sacrifice of 50-year-old firefighter Corey Contemporore. He was the man who was killed because he was using his own body to shield his wife and family from harm. And his name deserves to be remembered. I'm ashamed to admit that the thought that the shooting might have been a setup crossed my own mind momentarily before I heard that others beside the intended target had been injured and that one man had been killed. The other bad response to the shooting which I've come across is either some variation of schadenfreude, which is glee at someone else's misfortune if your German is not quite up to scratch, or worse, expressions of disappointment that the shooter missed. Really? Have some of us sunk as low as that? I remember another time when I had sat down to dinner in the main dining room at Founders Hall at Guilford College. It was the end of fall semester my sophomore year, December of 1980. John Lennon had just released his double fantasy album, and Mark David Chapman had gunned him down in cold blood at the hotel where he and Yoko had been living. One of my friends, Matt, who's a minister nowadays and has since grown up quite a lot, made some lame remark about Lennon finding out whether there was no heaven or hell. I looked straight at Matt and told him I didn't think that was funny and that it was inappropriate to make jokes like that when somebody had been killed, no matter what you happen to think of them. That silly remark that Lennon had made about the Beatles being more popular than Christ was absolutely irrelevant. Some things are just always wrong. I was recently rewatching The Fisher King, which is the story of how one man's careless remarks ruined both his life and another man's, and of how he found redemption for them both by going on a quest and obtaining what the other man needs in order to heal. Along the way, he happens to save the life of a third man who has tried to commit suicide. The second man, who saw the wife with whom he was very much in love get shot to death literally at his side, needs the Holy Grail, the symbol of God's divine grace, in order to heal. Or rather, he needs what he perceives to be the Holy Grail in order to heal. And when the first man, one of those radio shock jocks, what the first man, one of those radio shock jocks, needs in order to heal what you might call his own Fisher King wound, is to make amends to the other man for having set in motion the tragic events which led to the murder of the guy's wife. The Fisher King was charged by God with being the keeper of the Holy Grail, but incurred an incapacitating wound for his sin of pride. The king suffers in pain for many years, unable to love or to feel that he is loved, too ill to live but unable to die. One day a fool wanders into the castle and finds the king alone. Being a fool, he's simple-minded. He doesn't see a king, but a man, alone and in pain. He asks the king, why is he suffering? And when the king says that he's thirsty, the fool rushes and gets him a cup of water. As the king begins to drink, he realizes that his wound is healed and that the cup itself is indeed the Holy Grail. And in amazement, the king asks, how could you find what my brightest and bravest could not? The fool said, I don't know. I only knew that you were thirsty. As we come to the close of this message, I'm reminded of the final paragraph of Lincoln's first inaugural address. On the 40th day before the bombardment of Fort Sumter commenced and plunged this country into the bloodiest conflict in which we've ever been involved, he said, I am loath to close. We're not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Amen.